Donald Trump has recently floated the idea of eliminating the federal income tax through implementing high tariffs, a policy he refers to as an all-tariff policy. So the question is this possible? And wouldn't President Trump need to get Congress to join him? Or in the alternative, does he have any leverage to get Congress to agree? Or can Donald Trump just make these changes on his own, or at least through his new Secretary of Treasury? Well, let's get into it. Well, first, let's talk about how he may be able to get rid of the IRS. Here's the thing, folks. The U.S. tax code is written so vaguely and terribly that a change to law might not be required. The U.S. income tax code never bothers to define what an individual is. So while we can infer individual means human beings, as the tax code taxes individuals differently depending if they are married, single, widowed, or head of household. The law tells us nothing otherwise of what an individual is. So is an individual somebody in the United States of America? Is an individual someone who is under 18? Is an individual someone who is in a coma? Is an individual someone who is mentally incompetent? Is an individual someone who is not a U.S. citizen? Certainly you can die by regulation. Now, Donald Trump can simply appoint a new Secretary of Treasury to draft new regulations. And here's the process. When the U.S. Treasury makes and rewrites regulations, it must follow the Administrative Procedure Act, or APA, like most other federal agencies. The APA requires that when the Treasury Department intends to create new regulations, it must engage in a process known as notice and comment. That rulemaking process includes three main steps. First, the agency must publish a notice of proposed rulemaking. That's going to inform the public of the proposed regulation and invites comments before issuing the final regulation. But here is the potential problem. Regulations must be in harmony with the statutes, and here, the individual income tax law located in Title 26 of the U.S. Code. Now, if a regulation conflicts or restricts the statute, it becomes invalid to the extent of the conflict or restriction. So this principle ensures that the regulations align with the legislative intent. And so there is the chief problem if, say, Donald Trump restricted the income tax to some definition that would make no one subject to it. The new regulation, according to the APA, could be stricken down by the Supreme Court because it would essentially negate the entire individual income tax law, to which the first argument would be, well, hey, look, if the income tax code doesn't define individual, how can there be an individual income tax law? Now, what I would expect back is a counter argument that, hey, look, they defined it enough. Everyone knows what an individual is. The court should just apply its common usage, which means a single human being, as distinguished from a group. To which the counter argument would be something like this, that the definition would mean that every individual in the world would be subject to it. Why would the U.S. tax code apply to citizens of Morocco? And then I would expect the counter argument to be, well, that's what the regulations do. They limit individuals to mean just U.S. citizens, to which I would counter argue, well, that's an admission that the law does not define what an individual is. Now, hey, look, let's end this standoff. So perhaps I would change course with some strategic lawyering. Consider this. As it is right now, the Secretary of Treasury is mandated by Section 7601 of the Internal Revenue Code to canvass Americans for unreported income. That is, go around and try to find this unreported income wherever it could be. That is, at any time, for whatever reason, your right to privacy means nothing to the IRS's authority to run a perpetual snooping campaign. Now look, this violates the Fourth Amendment, but the government doesn't see it that way, as it wants your money. There is no bar to unreasonable searches and seizures. But why? Why can't a new Secretary of Treasury review the law and regulations, say, by Scott, the tax code as enforced is an affront to the Fourth Amendment, which forbids unreasonable searches and seizures. And as part of the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment is the highest law of the land. And because I have a conflict between the statute, that is Title 26, and the U.S. Constitution, the Constitution must prevail. Therefore, the new Secretary of Treasury conclude the only way to make the U.S. Constitution comply with the law is to define individual as a living person in the U.S. who consents to be taxed. Now, this would, of course, effectively end it. Now, I would expect the same challenges. This definition restricts the statute and undermines the law, to which the response is yes. It restricts the U.S. tax code so that it comports with the Constitution. Now, by playing this gambit, President Trump would force those who want the U.S. income tax as is to expose themselves. They would have to admit that the U.S. tax code is the highest law of the land. I think this is a political disaster. Now, then this would create huge leverage Trump could use to get Congress to agree to actually a legislative fix. And again, even though I expect challenges, making sure the IRS only has the powers delegated to it and debated by Congress the Constitution allows. Now, how can Trump enforce tariffs on his own? That question's a lot easier to answer, as Congress has already given U.S. presidents the ability to set tariff rates. Any U.S. president is allowed to set import tariff rates as a function of his authority to manage foreign affairs under the U.S. Constitution. Now, the Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, but Congress can delegate this power to the president under certain conditions. Congress has enacted various statutes that delegate authority to the president to adjust tariff rates and enter into trade agreements. For instance, the Tariff Act of 1930 and the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 are two examples of where Congress has provided the president with broad authority to negotiate trade agreements and modify tariffs to implement those agreements. The Supreme Court has upheld such delegations of authority as constitutional, recognizing that the president has a significant role in foreign affairs and trade negotiation. So there it is. If he becomes president, Donald Trump can effectively end the individual income tax via regulation and replace it with tariffs, as it's a both delegated function from Congress to the executive branch. Additionally, while he was on the Joe Rogan podcast in October of 24, Donald Trump said that outside forces were the ones who wanted the income tax, not Americans. If he meant what he said, he essentially was saying that the IRS is an armed insurrection against the American people. And look, there's an entire military code of justice to deal with that situation. A military code that Donald Trump would be commander-in-chief of. Now, if you're interested in ending the abuse of the income tax, the best thing you could possibly do is share and like this comment to raise the frequency levels of Americans. And be sure you subscribe so you know when we're going to go live and we can answer your difficult IRS tax questions and tell you all where this is going. This is Anthony Parent of IRSMedic, and I want to thank you for watching.